and the panelists themselves. Let me just quickly say that this is an enormous pleasure for all of us to be joined by these distinguished gentlemen. All of them are long-term friends of this council. You've seen them in our various programs over the years. We're absolutely delighted to have all of them with us. They represent, I think, the best of serious journalism. This council's closest ties intellectually among the various entities in the community probably are to the journalists who, on a serious level, attempt to, through what they do, raise the level of the national discussion, the national consciousness, and thus improve, hopefully, the quality of our foreign policy decisions. Each of these gentlemen is known to all of you. It's my pleasure to present or turn the panel over to Joseph R.L. Sterne, the former editor of the editorial pages of The Sun.
I wish to welcome everybody to this meeting of the Baltimore Sun Alumni Association. We all bear the scars and medals of having worked for that fine newspaper, and we are grateful for the opportunities that the Baltimore Sun gave us to work in our profession. I'm surrounded by experts on the Middle East, and I'm not one. But I would like to make one comment that has occurred to me during several years of semi-retirement, and that is that history is a process of constant revisionism. When Harry Truman left office, he was vilified, particularly by the Republicans, but had a very low rating among the American people. We all know now that he is a hero to Goldwater Republicans and other Americans. We know that John Adams was obscured by the two Virginians on either side of him until David McCulloch wrote a great book, and now everybody in the country loves John Adams. I want to say this because I would like to discuss, just for a brief moment, the relationship between George Bush, H.W. Bush Sr., and George W. Bush. When George H.W. Bush left office, he had very, very low ratings. He was denied a re-election, and he was pretty well discarded as a mediocre president by most people. Now we're in a situation where the lower his son's reputation goes, the higher George H.W. Bush's reputation goes. And I think that's a very good idea, a very good thing, because we do have revision and revision and revision in the process of history. People sometimes forget that George H.W. Bush was a champion of German reunification at a time when the British, and particularly the French, were trying to stop it. More pertinently for our discussion tonight, he was the president who threw the Iraqi armies out of Kuwait and stopped at the border. And because he stopped at the border, he was roundly denounced as a wimp, even though he was a World War II hero, as a wimp and as a man who had missed his historic opportunity. And along with him, such luminaries as General Scowcroft, General Powell, and Secretary Berger were also denounced. Now we are in a situation where some of his wisdom is being appreciated by the American people. And I think if I can make one little prediction, it is that George H.W. Bush's reputation and value among the American people will go up, perhaps in inverse proportion to the reputation of his son. Now, having said that, I will turn this meeting over to my fellow experts and people who really know a lot about the Middle East. So let's start with Mark Matthews, who was the State Department correspondent for the Baltimore Sun and also has had many years of experience in the Middle East.
Thank you, Joe. I've followed the Middle East as Joe said, as a State Department reporter, and also was sent there by Jeff Price for the period 99 to 2001. I went back in 2005, and again last August as part of research on a book that I'm doing about the relationship between the United States and Israel. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. Many of you may remember that earlier this year, two professors, one from Harvard, the other from the University of Chicago, published a paper on the influence of the pro-Israel lobby. The paper generated a lot more heat than light about America's relationship with Israel. On one side, it fed into conspiracy theories about dual loyalty and a cabal behind the war in Iraq. From the other side, the paper was denounced as anti-Semitic. One thing that didn't occur was a sober discussion of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Such a discussion, I think, is healthy. So here's a few observations. First, I think we need to get over this bugaboo about dual loyalty. It's an anachronism. The United States is one of a growing list of countries that allow dual citizenship. Many Americans have close ties overseas. If loyalty is an obligation of citizenship, then dual loyalty within the law should be acceptable. We're a global power with relationships, investments, and debts all over the world. K Street in Washington is full of highly paid American lobbyists for a variety of countries, some with unsavory regimes. Second point, American ties to Israel are indeed strong. They're almost familial, but they suffer strains, even during the Bush administration. One of the worst episodes came last year over Israel's sale of military technology to China. In that case, Israel's harshest critics were neoconservatives in the Pentagon. And it's a fact that the pro-Israel lobby, it's now both Jewish and Christian, heavily evangelical Christian, is powerful, well-financed, bipartisan, and sometimes intimidating, more so in Congress than in the executive branch. The leading group, AIPAC, understands how campaigns operate, how coalitions form, how policy is made, and how legislation gets passed. It uses that knowledge very well. But most members of Congress are not politically stupid. Israel would not get the support it does in Congress if it were not also popular with a majority of Americans. Other lobbies, representing Greece, Cuban exiles, and Taiwan, also have a big domestic constituency and wield strong influence. There's one member of Congress from Florida who is a go-to person both for the Israelis and the Miami Cubans. Two AIPAC officials currently stand accused of crossing the line and passing sensitive information to the Israeli embassy. The cases raise troubling First Amendment questions, but it does tend to explode some of the myths around AIPAC. The two AIPAC staffers thought that their Pentagon source was a real insider. He wasn't. He was looking at them to wield influence that they didn't really have. Israel gets a lot of American money. It's the largest recipient of foreign aid. Less well known is that its lobbyists are the engine driving all foreign aid legislation through Congress. And this benefits quite a considerable number of small countries. Many people who supported the Iraq War were also strong supporters of Israel. Some thought that shaking up the region would intimidate Syria and Iran and make the Palestinians more flexible. It also suited hardliners, both here and in Israel, to have Washington preoccupied in Iraq and not preoccupied with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But Iraq was never Israel's top priority. Since the 1990s, Israeli leaders visiting Washington have consistently pressed for a closer look and tougher action against Iran. Where many people fault AIPAC is its approach to the peace process, particularly in recent years. Historically, AIPAC has taken the position that it won't decide Israeli policies, and will support whatever government Israelis elect. In the past 5 years, we saw an Israeli government that resisted negotiations on a permanent settlement with the Palestinians. This dovetailed very well with the Bush administration's approach, because the Bush administration was very reluctant to get involved. Both the United States and Israel viewed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the prism of the war on terrorism. When the United States did get involved, Israelis tended to see it as an effort to calm down our Arab allies, and more often than not, they were right. The administration and AIPAC have played into Israel's tendency to view security solely in terms of threats, from terror, from incitement, from Syria, from Iran. Both the United States and Israel generally refuse to talk to their adversaries. In my view, too little attention has been paid to the strategic benefits that would accrue to Israel from peace with its neighbors. Until very recently, voices making this argument in Washington have hardly been heard. Most Israelis accept as an article of faith that there is no partner on the other side. And Americans have gone along. Outside the corridors of power, another dimension to the debate is gaining more and more prominence. Supporters of Israel have gone after Israel's critics in a number of institutions, including Human Rights Watch, the UN, and some American universities. There's a, excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water. Am I taking too long, Joe? There's been a hardening of attitudes on all sides. The result has been to create an ideological battleground in places where solutions to the conflict and the region's problems could be tackled seriously. This represents a huge waste of knowledge and talent. Israel is a dynamic country with great scientific and technological skills. It could make a remarkable contribution to the surrounding region. It could eventually be an aid donor rather than a major recipient. And it could contribute to and spread understanding about international law instead of being always on the defensive. Israel gained considerable diplomatic stature after Oslo, and even more once it withdrew from Lebanon in the year 2000. In recent years, it's become more isolated. Meaningful diplomacy is mostly a two-way channel between the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem and the White House. The isolation has been compounded by the Lebanon war, which also fed Israel's sense of insecurity. Israel has relied on a reputation for responding hard to any attack. Now many Israelis feel as though they've lost their deterrent power. Rubbing it in, there are some conservatives in Washington who have started to question Israel's value as a strategic ally. With what's been happening in the deteriorating situation in Iraq and in Gaza, the crisis in Iran is getting more and more difficult to manage, and it is really going to be the ultimate test of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It is going to be extremely important for the United States and Israel to deal very soberly with the information that they have, so that neither is misled or fooled by inadequate intelligence. And the American people are going to have to face up to the fact that if Israel is seriously threatened, 5 decades of friendship and commitment by the United States to Israel's security are going to have to mean something. Otherwise, our reputation around the world is going to suffer even more. But one of the things that really has to be sorted out is how much of a genuine threat Ahmadinejad is posing. Is it a sign of intent, the hateful things that he says about Israel, or is it a cheap applause line, which nowadays is really striking a chord throughout the region? Historically, Iran has looked to the Persian Gulf and wanted to dominate that region. If that's the case, then it's more America's responsibility and America's concern, and it kind of takes the heat off Israel. On the other hand, it could be that Israel is really the main target for Iran. I'm not sure we know all that well, but the states and the U.S.-Israeli relationship are getting higher. Thank you.
Go ahead,
I'm Robert Ruby. It's good to see everyone here, and it's very nice of Dr. Berger to have us all. I want to very briefly talk about the United States as a way of making a point about the Middle East. One strength of this country that we often just accept without really thinking about is the existence of a firewall between religion and the state. It doesn't mean they're perfectly sealed off from each other. Religion has had a big influence on government since the days of the Founding Fathers, but we know that fundamentally the government is secular. That firewall serves as a sort of guarantee that the people who are governing believe in this world. They're not trying to hasten the arrival of a Messiah for some better world. It's our guarantee that that our leaders believe that what we can see and what we hear is what counts. Another often underappreciated strength of this country is that it is in every sense larger than any particular religious denomination. That's not true of Iraq. We know it's not true of Iran. It's not true of Saudi Arabia. I think the strength of secularism over religion is a very iffy proposition for large parts of Lebanon. I'll be interested to hear what Jeff Price has to say about that. I think it's a very iffy proposition for Gaza. And there are a couple of rules of thumb I've heard many times, which is if a country has dozens of religious denominations, it's going to be a democracy, and we're living in one. If a country has two religions, well, you risk having a civil war, and Iraq might be an example of that, where it has two or three, arguably. And if a country has one religion that plays a big part in official life, well, you're going to risk having despotism. And I think Iran might be an example of that. In the Middle East, we have this situation where religion is in danger of trumping nationality. That firewall either never existed or it's nearing collapse. And if you're in a country where the economic conditions are so dire, and if the political culture is so unresponsive to people's needs, I think it's quite rational that people do turn to religion. And when the situation gets truly desperate, think of Gaza, think of the Shiites of southern Lebanon from a decade or two ago. Well, in those desperate situations, you start having a very personal conversation with your God. And these are, I think people have these, they sincerely believe they're having these conversations. The God tells you that someone else is the enemy. The God tells you that one or another parcel of land is your land. And those conversations are nearly impossible to interrupt, because who are we to interrupt your conversation with your deity? I worry that in a few years, what we now think of as secular, semi-despotic Syria is going to seem like, boy, what a paradise that was. And secular, chaotic, corrupt Egypt, boy, what a golden age we were living then, when that country disappears. I think that these economic issues, social issues simply have got to be solved if we're going to avoid entering an age where religion trumps all. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dan Berger, excuse me, and I am at least as inexpert on the Middle East as Joe. I think a bit more so. But I've been a generalist, and I'm a generalist at the moment. I wrote about all manner of foreign policy for Joe as an editorial writer. My only professional visit to the Middle East is when I was the Sun's correspondent in London in the time now remembered as Black September in 1970, when my editors said, finally, we're ready for the war that's coming in the Middle East. We're going to have everybody in place. And I got back from covering the Sweden's election. Can you believe that the Baltimore Sun used to cover Swedish elections? And I got back to London, and there was this message: go to Israel soonest, stay at the American Colony Hotel. I couldn't because the whole journalistic world was there. I had to go somewhere else. And check in with the stringer and get acquainted, and we're ready for the war. And Joe was in Bonn at the time, and they sent him to Jordan. And we were ready. We were ready, but the war never came. In Egypt, we had a man there. Nasser died, and that was interesting, but he died of natural causes. So that's my experience in the Middle East. As to foreign policy, the Bush administration came in with one strong idea, and it's associated with a group of people known as neoconservatives, and it was that we are the lone superpower, the only one, and that confers prerogatives and responsibilities. And when things are gravely wrong, it's up to us to set them right, to make the world perform in a way that's safe for us and for those we value. And this great determination to go to war in Iraq flowed from that idea. There are a couple of things wrong with the idea, in my opinion. One is that nuclear weapons, which it's based on, have limited usefulness. The president of Venezuela is not afraid that we're going to nuke him. He's afraid that we're going to assassinate him, not that we're going to nuke him. Our great powers, through the Cold War, were based largely on being the strongest economy and having a near monopoly on science after Hitler destroyed Europe's science. These things are somewhat diminishing, and our role as the world's great power is somewhat diminishing now, not in a traumatic way like Austria after World War I, and not in as dramatic a way as the United Kingdom after World War II, but just incrementally as other countries in Asia, big ones, small ones, have enormous economic growth and are starting science. And as the oil-producing countries, while they still produce it, have great economic growth. A story about that in the New York Times this morning, unless it was yesterday, was about the boomtown of Khartoum in Sudan. It's an oil country now, it didn't used to be, and investment is pouring in. Well, none of it's ours. because we have sanctions on Sudan. They don't miss us. Our business is missing out, but the countries pouring investment in are China, India, the United Arab Emirates, Malaysia. Who needs us? Our great power during the Cold War came not only from our economic power and our science, but also our diplomacy, our concept of collective security, our seeking the broadest possible alliances. I'll mention one of them to you. It was called CENTO, or Bagdato, and it consisted of Pakistan, Iran, and Iraq, and us, against the threat of communism. Well, Iraq pulled out, Iran pulled out, and we're left with Pakistan. But the thought of going it alone or having a pickup coalition of the willing, doesn't need to be very many or very much from them, is really not maximizing our strength. And I think many people now believe that in the Iraq war, we have reduced our strength, we have created anti-Americanism, and in the notion of balance of power politics, when the small countries gang up against one that's too big and too pushy, guess who that is? That's us. And then you have the presidents of Venezuela and Iran making common cause and being great friends. We inspire that. If we'd been a little shrewder, maybe we would not have inspired that. Winston Churchill got up in the House of Commons in 1922 and to speak about the Irish question, talked about the cataclysm of the Great War, World War I, and how when it was all over and the world had been transformed in so many ways, the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone still retain the integrity of their quarrel. And the integrity of their quarrel is something that we are ignoring throughout much of the Islamic world, in North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia. And I don't mean their quarrel with us, and I don't mean their quarrel with Israel, both of which are obvious and we see and they're there. There are so many quarrels. In Sudan, the situation in Darfur, I was just looking up and it's full of 19th century roots. And we like to blame things on the British Empire. We can blame this on the British Empire because it was only in 1916 that the British Army managed to attach Darfur to Sudan, where Britain and its protectorate, Egypt, had a condominium and were jointly running Sudan. There's a long history behind the acts of genocide that are taking place in Sudan today of Muslim against Muslim. To us, it's just frustrating. It's inconvenient. And as Henry Kissinger used to tell people, small peoples, they should realize that the concerns of the great powers take precedence, priority. They should step back and realize that it was then the Cold War that's important. Now it's our so-called war against terrorism that's important. But these peoples have their reasons. They go back a long way, have a big history. when President Bush brought the presidents of Afghanistan and Pakistan together in New York, had dinner, and say, now be friends, because you're not being friends prevents us from catching the Taliban, from catching Al-Qaeda. So there is a huge history of bad relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It would be, I would go way over the time limit to try and say what it is. It's very difficult for them to be friends. And President Bush has talked when he came into office about being humble in his foreign policy. And I think that we'd have a little more influence in the world if we were a little more humble, as he first set out to be. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jeff Price. I also was with the Sun for a long time, and I was, in addition to being a Middle East foreign correspondent, stationed in Beirut in the 70s when our office was in Beirut and I was spending all my time in Jerusalem, and in the 80s when our office was in Jerusalem and I was spending all my time in Beirut. So we never really picked the right places for offices in the Middle East anyway. I think we eventually moved to Cairo because Beirut was getting unsafe. And it was at about the time that the Civil War was starting in Beirut, and a lot of American companies were moving down there too, only to regret it rather quickly. And there's a sort of an expression, there are 3 words in Arabic. One of them is inshallah, God willing. Another one is bukra, which is the Arabic word for tomorrow, and an Englishman once described it to me as sort of like mañana, but without the same sense of urgency. And malesh, another Arabic expression which means sort of who gives a darn anyway. Anyway, those 3 words form the acronym IBM. And when all the companies moved to, all the American companies moved to Cairo back in the 70s when the Civil War started in Lebanon, the whole organization, the whole operation became known as Inshallah Bukra Malesh. So I was also foreign editor for 10 years and had the pleasure of working with Robert Ruby when he was in the Middle East, and Ruby came back and agreed to become my assistant, which was essentially to run the entire foreign desk when I was foreign editor. And Tom Bowman also was working in Washington with me when I was foreign editor, and of course Mark Matthews, who was the State Department correspondent, and happily my Middle East correspondent. He is the only Middle East correspondent we ever had who was stationed in Tel Aviv. And this, I mean, you speak about how people take certain things. I'm sure everybody in this room knows about the argument between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and where the embassies are and so forth. And there was a time when a lot of companies wanted to keep their offices in Tel Aviv also. Mark wanted to be in Tel Aviv because there was a better school for his daughter to go to. And I said, well, we're getting enough flack from people in this community who are big supporters of Israel without moving the bureau from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, when they're all talking about everything should be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, including the United States Embassy. So I said, you will drive to Jerusalem every day, and you will file from Jerusalem, and that will be your dateline, and the office will stay there. So we spent a lot of time talking on the telephone when he was commuting between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I started in the Middle East as a correspondent in 1973, and just returned from the Middle East, having spent 10 days in Beirut and about 10 days in Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. And looking back on 33 years, in some ways, it's very easy to say that there's been no progress. In fact, that things have gotten really a lot worse. Lebanon has become a completely different country in many ways, radicalized, deep influence from Hezbollah, which did not exist when I was there in the 70s. In fact, one could say that Hezbollah was the creation of Israel, because I remember going into Lebanon with the Israeli army in August of 1982, about 2 months after they had invaded Lebanon. And the Israelis very happily would introduce us to Shiites, prominent Shiites in southern Lebanon, who were delighted that the Israelis had come in. There actually had been people in southern Lebanon who threw water, rose water and flowers and rice at the incoming Israeli forces. And these people were particularly happy, especially happy, and only happy actually, because the Israelis had come in to get rid of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians had been making life miserable for the Shiite population of the South because they had turned the South into a sort of target for the Israelis. The South, in my time, had become known as Fatah land. 6 months later, when the Israelis made it clear that they weren't withdrawing anytime soon, the same Shiite leaders that we had gone to see with them were sort of taking us off to the side and saying, you know, do you think they're going to leave anytime soon? Because we're starting to have a problem here. The population here is becoming increasingly radicalized. And the Amal movement, which was the relatively moderate Shiite movement, was being overtaken by a more radical, fundamental, religious, Islamic fundamental group known as Hezbollah. Well, the Israelis not only didn't leave in 6 months, they didn't leave in 1 year, they didn't leave in 20 years. So, or was it 20? When did they, 18? A long time anyway. And in the process, they created a situation in Lebanon which gave rise to Hezbollah. Was it just because Hezbollah wants to get rid of Israel? No, Hezbollah wanted Israel out of Lebanon. And one of the reasons, I mean, there were many reasons why they wanted them out. But the economic impact of the Israeli occupation was doing an enormous amount of damage to commerce in southern Lebanon. Roadblocks were being set up. All sorts of things were being done for the sake of Israeli security inside Lebanon, not inside Israel. And that meant tearing down olive groves, it meant tearing down banana plantations where Hezbollah soldiers, fighters presumably were hiding. So it was somewhat distressing to be in Lebanon in August, around the same time that Mark was in the Middle East, seeing all this happen and thinking there must have been some way to avoid the situation, conditions being what they are 20 years later, 24 years after the initial invasion. Incidentally, just on a sort of a lighter side of that event, when Israel first invaded Lebanon, I was an editorial writer for the Evening Sun. And Joe and I were taken to, or actually we took, or Joe took me and an Israeli general to lunch at the Center Club. And the general was on a mission to try to build up support with editorial boards for the the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And we had a very nice lunch at the Center Club, and this general promised, as everyone in Israel was promising, that the Israeli army would never go into Beirut. Do you remember that? 3 or 4 years later, I saw this general, this very same general, in Shimon Peres's office he was working with Peres. He was a military advisor to Shimon Peres. And I went up to him and I said, General, what happened in 1982? The last time I saw you, we were having lunch in Baltimore, and you said the Israeli army would never go to Beirut. And he looked at me, didn't even blink an eyelash, said, that wasn't the Israeli army, that was Ariel Sharon's army. So, as I say, in many ways it looks as if things are only getting worse. But, well, a couple of things. First of all, during this last trip to the Middle East, where I was in Damascus on my way into Beirut, and spent a lot of time talking to various people, all different walks of life in Lebanon. Ditto in Israel, in the West Bank and Gaza. And you cannot help but coming away from an experience, at least I can't, help coming away from an experience like that, thinking these people are the smartest, the most enterprising, the Israelis, the Syrians, and the Palestinians. If they could ever get together, they would rule the world. They would certainly rule the region. And there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be able to do that. Thank you.
I'm Tom Bowman. I used to be with the Sun and joined NPR back in the spring, and just got back from Iraq a couple weeks back. Was here for a little over a month. Got around the country throughout the Baghdad neighborhoods, north of Baghdad to the Taji National Depot of the Iraqis, out to Anbar province for a week, and came under RPG fire and sniper fire. Happily got the sniper fire on tape, and even more happily, it didn't connect with me. So I want to talk a little bit about what I saw on the trip and a little bit of what we've heard over the past couple of days from the President and from General Casey in Iraq and the Ambassador. And tomorrow we'll hear a little more from Defense Secretary Rumsfeld about his views on this. It's sort of a full court press this week from all the officials. The sense I got when I was there is certainly it's more dangerous. I was here a year and a half ago for the Sun, much worse than it was back then. And everyone will tell you that, the Iraqis, military officers, particularly the mid-level officers, the majors, lieutenant colonels. If you want to find out what's going on in a city, you don't talk to the police chief, you talk to the beat cops. And that's true in Iraq as well. The sense there among the officers and the soldiers is very little faith in Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. They don't think he has the guts to do what has to be done. He's not allowing them to go into Sadr City, the teeming slum in Baghdad that's run by the Mehdi Army. He's not taking on Muqtada al-Sadr, who runs the Mehdi Army. And another problem is they're not spending the money in Anbar province that they should. The city of Fallujah was supposed to get $225 million to rebuild. It's gotten a little less than half of that. The finance minister has no interest. He's a Shia, by the way, has no interest in helping Sunnis. $75 million was supposed to go to the province for general rebuilding. Nothing from that budget has gone out. There's no local government in Anbar province. There's no police force. That's being run by the Marine Corps in Anbar province and some Army units. Militarily, we heard the President today say, and we heard General Casey say the same thing, that 6 of the 10 Iraqi Army divisions are in the lead. The Iraqi Army division I was with in Anbar province, the 1st Iraqi Army division, is grossly undermanned. A battalion is supposed to have 750 soldiers. The 2 battalions I was with, one had 120 soldiers, the other had 140. So you basically have a battalion with a company-sized element. And the local mayor where I was north of Fallujah with this Marine battalion. And I asked the lieutenant colonel about it. I said, what are you guys going to do? He said, he just shrugged his shoulders and said, we're just going to have to pick up the slack until they can. And I said, well, you know, General Casey said a year to year and a half, they'll be ready to take this over without any or very little U.S. help. And he said, 3 to 5 years. So that's a reality that I saw in Iraq. And for the average Iraqi, life has gotten worse. I'll never forget, I was in this, the Jihad neighborhood in Baghdad. We were doing sweeps with the army unit there. And this elderly woman came up to us in the traditional dress. She was probably in her late 70s, early 80s. And she told the officer I was with that she was forced from her home. She was a Sunni, and the Shia, many people think, and there's a lot of evidence to this, are trying to ethnically cleanse Baghdad. And she said, I got a note that says you have to leave within a week. And she said, I ignored it. And the next note came with an AK-47 bullet in it. And she said, I left. This is an old woman. We had, I was there for a little over a month, and we had 3 incidents involving translators. We share a compound with ABC News. One of our translators, her brother was a pharmacist, also a Shia, and he was shot dead in his pharmacy by Sunni gunmen. And we said, why? She said, because he was a Shia. ABC had a translator, one of 3 boys, men really. A brother was shot dead, the second brother was kidnapped, and the second brother called the third brother and said, if you don't come and get me, they'll kill me. He went to get his second brother, he was kidnapped. And the third incident happened the night before I left. We broke the fast, the Ramadan fast, with a family member of one of our translators. She's a physician, worked for UNICEF, 5 months pregnant, with a 4-year-old daughter. And she got a call the night before I left and said, we know where you live and who you are. We know you're a doctor, we know you work for UNICEF, and we know where your daughter goes to preschool. You have a week to leave the country. So where's this all heading? I'm hearing that after the election, there's a good chance they'll increase troops in Iraq, U.S. troops. Or at the very least, to extend the troops that are there now that are supposed to come out, or accelerate those heading over. There's also a plan, I understand, to concentrate more of the U.S. troops in places like Baghdad and also Ramadi, the largest city in Anbar province. And another element is to increase the number of U.S. trainers over there as well. There are about 4,000 trainers there now. They're expecting to maybe double that number. Those are some of the proposals we're looking at. But nothing will be done really probably until after the election. And I'll leave you with one thought of an Iraqi I got to know pretty well over there. And he just told me before I left, I said, what's going on here? And he just sighed and he said, we're lost.
Our format tonight is that each of my colleagues can make comment on what the other ones have said if they wish. But pretty soon we want to open the floor to questions from the audience. But Robert Ruby has a question.
Jeff, in a minute or two, what's your, and I'm serious about this, what's your Middle East peace plan? And I'd like to ask Tom, who I haven't had the chance to talk with since this latest Iraq trip, on what his, if we'll make each of these gentlemen Secretary of State and Defense Secretary, what his Iraqi stabilization plan is in just a space of a minute or two. And I would ask Mark what his diplomatic stabilization plan is for the United States to sort of right the whole enterprise.
Go
You know, I think that reporters, columnists, and editorial writers hate it when a question like that is put to you. Like, what's your plan to end all this? It's all right. It reminds me of Ray Jenkins once telling me, and I'm sure that others have used this expression too, that editorial writers are the ones who come in after the battle and kill all the wounded. You know, it's not as if we've got anything really constructive to say. And yeah, I have some pretty radical ideas, and I'll give them to you in about possibly a little bit more than a minute. There does need to be regime change in the Middle East, for one thing. I don't think that we've gone about it the right way. This whole idea that the Iraqi experience was going to lead to the democratization of that region was one of the most foolish ideas I've ever heard of, at least in the way that they were going to do it. We could, for one thing, go to the United States, could go to our friends and say that we need more real cooperation from you guys on this. And I would include Israel in that list of friends in terms of the sorts of supporters that we need support from now. It doesn't mean that they should not react to protect themselves, but it does mean that they should stop building settlements, which they are. They are still doing it, in violation of a word given to Condi Rice when she was there. They should take that wall and put it on the Green Line, not on Israel, not on Palestinian or disputed territory. If they're perfectly, we can build a wall to go along the Mexican border. Are we building it in Mexican territory? Is anybody building a secure wall, a fence, or anything else on somebody else's territory without somebody negotiating it? No, I don't think so. We could go to the president of Egypt and tell him that it's time to stop being a tyrant and a dictator, to try to find some way to bring greater democracy to his country without necessarily bringing about an Islamic revolution. I've heard the story. Everybody who goes to Cairo hears the same story. You let the Islamic or the Muslim Brotherhood have full sway, we'll have one election and that'll be the last one. Well, I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. There's a reason why the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, is so popular in Egypt these days. It's because the government is corrupt, because there is a ruling elite that is sucking the country dry. People react to that. And people react to it by supporting radical organizations who they hope will go out and shoot these guys, hang them by the neck. So you can go to a government and say there are other ways. One is to sort of diminish the pressure on people to turn to radicalism. And I would say the same of the government in Jordan. You know, if it applies in Syria, why doesn't it apply in Jordan? Why doesn't it apply in Egypt? And I would say the same of the Saudi government and most of the governments in the Gulf. All these people that we say are our friends, the ones that we think that this contagious democracy from Iraq was going to suddenly send into a tizzy of democracy on their own. There are ways to do this, and we have a responsibility to say these things seriously to people, to our friends in that region. I think that's one way of diminishing the kinds of pressures that cause the violence. The people in southern Lebanon that I was talking about, they were not radicalized entirely by the arrival of the Israelis either. They were radicalized because the Lebanese government that we had been supporting in that part of the world didn't give a damn about them for 40 years. You have to do things that diminish the pressure to make people violent and radical. That's one way to help us get out of it.
Your stabilization plan, Mr. Secretary.
Stabilization plan? After being there a little over a month, my gut would tell me to hand the keys of the place to Muqtada al-Sadr and say, best of luck and hope you can keep the lights on. A more rational plan, I was talking to a State Department guy in Anbar, and he'd been there almost 3 years, and I think he He was probably had a better handle on the place than anybody. And he thought that they should just reduce troops drastically to 30, 40,000, like they had in Korea, and have really all those troops be trainers or civil affairs people who would help rebuild the country. And then you move everybody else to Kuwait in case you need a rapid reaction force. That seemed to make the most sense.
No, there's no way to
Secretary.
to settle the whole thing, but there's a couple of things that are not being done that could be done and could inch this forward. One is to get the Israelis and Palestinians talking again. There's several people on the Palestinian side who would be perfectly good interlocutors. They can't at this point bring their people with them, but that's at least a start. At least it opens a dialogue. And another thing is for the United States to be talking to the people whom the others can't talk to. If Israel can't talk to Hamas, then there are half a dozen English-speaking, Western-educated Hamas leaders who we may hate, but at least they speak the language. And I think the United States has to really start finding out about these groups directly. And a third thing is direct contact between the United States and Iran.
Robert Ruby wants to make one quick comment.
I think all three of my colleagues made a key point without actually saying this particular thing, where I think one of the important actions for the United States is to talk to people it doesn't much like. You don't get to choose your enemies. Things like, going back to ancient history, the SALT treaties were not negotiated with Ecuador. If you need something from Syria, perhaps you should talk to the Syrians. If you need something from Iran just to make Iraq a little more stable, perhaps you should talk with the Iranians. I think Hamas is a very tough case. I wouldn't want to be the Secretary of State or the President who takes that step, but you can't talk to people in Ecuador about problems in the Middle East.
I'm going to questions.
Joe, can I just second what Robert said? Because in my experience in the last visit there, over and over and over, from people who you would think really hate us, and in many cases have every reason to hate us, kept on saying, we need to talk. There needs to be a conversation. You need to find somebody who's going to